So a quick summary of last two classes is that um, a material can exist in different forms, polycrystalline, single crystalline, and non-crystalline form, amorphous form, and how a physical parameter is affected or varied in these three forms itself. Thin film form also is a special category of material form, but in terms of dimensionality, a thin film has uh, see, you're imagining length and breadth, but thickness-wise, it starts from a few nanometers to a few microns. So when a thin film is of few microns, it's no more called a thin film. And also, I mentioned to you in the beginning that any definition where if you define that to a certain extent, to a certain thickness, a film can be called thin film. Say, for example, half a micron or 1 micron. So beyond that, it's not called a thin film anymore, which is wrong. That's a very generic explanation, but in physics terms, a thin film is defined as that form of the material where the crystallinity exists. That means, we are using a substrate on which we are growing these atomic layers until the point you see the crystallinity. It is called thin film. So for thin film growth, one requirement is, you need to have a base material, that is the substrate. And so the nucleation of the incoming atoms happen on the substrate. So then the growth takes place. So it's a substrate dependent growth process. So what are the parameters that are important in a thin film growth process? Substrate, the substrate temperature, and of course the pressure during the growth process. These three parameters are very important in order to get a thin film growth. Now, the lattice that forms, you have those lattice blocks or lattice units that are to be formed uniformly, leading to a crystalline growth, right? And this growth is not infinite. You can't grow a material into a thin film form with a high degree of crystallinity beyond a certain thickness. And this is normally not more than half a micron. Okay. So you take oxide materials and sulfides, nitrides. You cannot get crystallinity beyond 500 nanometers. 500 nanometers is the upper limit. What happens beyond that? Beyond that, what happens is the polycrystallinity sets in. So, and 1 micron and beyond fall under the category of thick films. And if the coating thickness is a few millimeters, right? Tens of microns to millimeters, you call them coatings, surface coatings. Each one of these categories again. So again, in thin films, you can categorize them based on the thickness range. You see, all the way from one atomic layer, one monolayer to 500 nanometers, where up to which point you'll have crystallinity. And a crystalline thin film is called an epitaxial film. That is the terminology that is used to describe crystallinity in thin films. So up to the point where epitaxy is, crystallinity is there, you can call it a thin film. Can we determine up to what thickness exactly the lattice is highly crystalline? Yes, we can. We have, um, crystallography, microscopy methods to ascertain at what thickness level the crystallinity in a thin film is lost, beyond what thickness it is lost, up to what thickness the crystallinity persists. That's the reason why I started uh, giving you a detailed introduction about the polycrystallinity and single crystallinity. So if you go back and visit the first lecture, so I gave this example of, so if you look at this three-dimensional block, and if you take one of these blocks as um, as a unit cell, that is a basic building block. So it's a repetition of these unit cells in 3 dimensions, right? So whatever volume you're looking at, say 1 centimeter cube. So these unit cells have to repeat in a periodic fashion throughout this volume without any misorientations, misfits. And of course, in a single crystal, you have this whole thing is one entity. So you call it one grain. That's it. So you always find the long range order, right? This unit cell, long range order in the sense that the unit cell here and the unit cell there are correlated, because there is no information lost from the way you talk about the arrangement of atoms in this unit cell, the orientation of that particular unit to the arrangement of atoms, and the orientation in the n+1th unit cell. So that's what is meant by a single crystal. Of course, to ascertain that a crystal is a crystal, one needs to do a lot of measurements. First of all, I also mentioned that single crystal growth is, a very tedious process, in the sense that um, uh, it's a high temperature process where you have you need to take the material to its melting point, and then slow cooling is required, which is not the case when you come to polycrystalline systems. So polycrystallinity, again, the name itself suggests that you have that volume of the material is subdivided into several small regions of crystals. That's why it's called polycrystalline. Crystallinity is still there, but in small pockets, right? Not like in this case where the entire volume is crystalline, and here the same volume is now subdivided into several small regions. So if you take, so these regions are called grains, and grains are separated by grain boundaries. And I mentioned that grain boundary is it's a defect. It's a serious defect, crystallographic defect in these systems, polycrystalline systems. So you have, I mentioned about the point defects, which are Schottky defects, missing atoms, and you have atoms displaced to non-atomic positions. These are called interstitials or Frankel defects. And we have dislocations, screw dislocation, edge dislocation, stacking faults. These are all a part of a crystal, right? But if you're talking about a perfect crystal, you need to get a crystal without those stacking faults, screw dislocations, and other dislocations. But you cannot get a crystal without vacancies and interstitials. Even in the natural crystals, you always have these missing atoms. There's nothing like a perfect crystal, right? But that is fine. It's only you're talking about a small percentage of atoms missing from the lattice, and that happens because the whole process of single crystal growth is a high temperature process. So you melt the material, uh, take the material to its melting point, and then cool it down extremely slowly. And it is that cooling rate that determines what kind of a quality crystal you get. So, in simple terms, you're allowing sufficient time for the atoms to find their lattice positions. That point number one. Point number two, when it comes to polycrystalline systems, like what you're seeing here, why you have the formation of small pockets of single crystalline regions? This is because of the following reason. Single crystal growth requires melts. You have to start with the molten part of a material. That means every material, if you want to grow it into a single crystalline form, you have to take it to its melting point. So if the melting point of a material is 1000 degrees centigrade, so you melt it at that temperature, 1500 degrees centigrade. The problem, of course, arises dealing with materials with high melting points. No, well, ideally, in the lab level, diamond also could be made, and diamond we know is made of carbon atoms. Okay, it's an allotrope of carbon. You have carbon, graphite, carbon, and various other forms of carbon systems there. In the nano world, you have carbon atoms arranged in the form of graphene, the wonder 2D material. You have carbon atoms arranged in the form of single wall nanotubes, multi-wall nanotubes. And one of the best examples of a zero-dimensional system, which was one of the systems that was first discovered, was carbon atoms arranging themselves in the form of a ball. Right? This is called C60. 60 carbon atoms buckling up in the form of a ball, and this is called Buckminster fullerene. So carbon has all its forms. You know, the bulk form is graphite and diamond, and it has. You can also give carbon allotropes as good examples for the 2D, 1D, and zero-dimensional nanosystems. The 2D system is the graphene, which is a single layer of graphite. No, graphite is a layered compound, and if you manage to peel off one layer, it becomes graphene. And that's a two-dimensional nanosystem. The one-dimensional nanosystem of carbon is these nanorods, and the zero-dimensional system is the buckyballs, the C60. They're very interesting systems, you know, of carbon. So even though in the lab level, I'll be able to make a diamond, but of course, to make a single crystal of diamond, you need extremely high pressures, which is not the case for growing, say, for example, silicon or many of the other materials. What is required is high temperature, a slow cooling process, right? You have methods like Czochralski, Bridgman technique, Skytopoulos method. These are the single crystal growth methods. Single crystal growth methods are completely different from thin film growth methods. They're also different from the polycrystalline growth methods. Polycrystalline growth is the simplest of all. It doesn't require the material to be heated to its melting point. Right. So coming back to this example of carbon, I can actually make a piece of diamond in the lab, but I need extremely high pressures, no, a few gigapascals. In addition to that, you need to melt carbon at extremely high temperatures, 3000 degrees centigrade and above, right? And at the lab level, to achieve such high temperatures is not easy. It's a big challenge, right? So when it comes to polycrystalline system, so now you understand that for a single crystal growth, you start from a melt, and the melt is slow cooled, right? Extreme slow cooling. So you're giving sufficient amount of time for all the atoms to find their lattice positions, and uh, you know, and then leading to crystallization. What happens in the case of a polycrystalline system? In a polycrystalline system, you start with, if you're making, say, a barium titanate, okay, BaTiO3, which is a good dielectric material. You have to start with the individual constituents. You can start with metallic barium, metallic titanium. You mix them in proper stoichiometric proportions, and of course, O3 is there, oxygen. So you need to heat the metallic, the cationic mixture in an oxygen atmosphere, so that you get the final phase. But that's not the way to do. Even though there are two metals sitting in the lattice of barium titanate, but it is an oxide compound, right? So the ideal way is to start with oxides of the constituent elements, that is barium and titanium. So you start with a stable, standard, available oxide of oxide or any other form, carbonate or any other form of say barium. Since you want the final compound to be in the form of an oxide form, BaTiO3. So you start with barium oxide or barium carbonate, titanium oxide or titanium carbonate. That's how you start. And then what happens is these two compounds, which are the stable forms of barium and titanium, they're mixed together in a proper stoichiometric ratio, and this mixture has to be heated because the new phase has to form. So you start with barium carbonate and titanium dioxide, and then just by physically mixing these two different compounds, you don't get the new one. You need to basically you need to basically uh, heat up the constituent mixture so that the bonds in barium carbonate or barium oxide and titanium dioxide, they break up, and then the new bonds form, leading to the formation of the final phase. And you have to choose a proper temperature at which the final phase forms. So one has to go through the thermodynamic phase diagrams first to see whether a reaction between two constituent compounds is possible, leading to the final compound called BaTiO3. So that's where phase diagrams play a crucial role. Okay, so the basic thing there is this heating of constituent compounds need not be at very high temperature, right? Normally, you heat the compounds as a thumb rule at 0.92 of the melting point. So if the melting point of the constituent compounds is say 1000 degrees centigrade, so if you heat it up to 92, 93%, 0.92 I said, so it's about 920 degrees centigrade is sufficient. So at that temperature, what happens is you're actually mixing up individual particles, right? I'll explain it to you here. And these particles, let me just create a slide here. Yeah. So look, if I take, say, two, let's say, so I want to make, say, barium titanium oxide. Okay? So very important material that's used in many devices. So this is your AbO3. A there and B there, B cation. All right. So I said that the most stable form of barium is, of course, barium oxide, but barium oxide is also a little hygroscopic. So you start with um, the stable form of barium, that is barium carbonate. Plus, you go for the stable form of titanium dioxide, right? So barium carbonate is there, and titanium dioxide, right? Now, if I take barium carbonate in the form of, say, a big chunk, let's say a rod like this, and titanium dioxide like this, like the way I have drawn there, okay? Now, a reaction should happen between these two. And where does the reaction happen? Of course, for if I have to make a single crystal of barium titanate, I first have to make barium titanate and then melt it and then slow cool it. So insert a new slide here. So right. So you start with the melt in the case of a single crystal growth, and you need to follow an extremely slow cooling process in order to get the. Okay. Now, for a polycrystalline system, you don't have to really worry about going to the melt. That's the easiest part. So you're staying somewhere at 0.92 of TM, right? And then you normally don't follow this stringent cooling process that is normally required for single crystal growth. So you end up like that. But this comes with, of course, the time taken to make a polycrystalline sample is much lesser than what it takes in the case of a single crystal. But you also need not start with the melt of a system. But then what you end up with is, right, polycrystalline system, which is for quick measurements, a polycrystalline system is okay. But I can start with this polycrystalline material, which is a final compound, and I can then take it to its melting point and make a single crystal. So to make a single crystal, you need the material in its final form. Okay, all right. So you're starting there at this point, following some, I would say, rapid cooling rate. This is a slow cooling rate here. The extremely slow cooling rate and the rapid cooling rate. This is time in hours, let's say. Okay, so this process leads to polycrystallinity, and that leads to single crystallinity. I'm not going through the whole thermodynamic process of how single crystallization happens, because it's a completely beyond the purview of this, the present topics. But in simple terms, you always remember it's a slow cooling that you follow in the case of a single crystal, that doesn't permit the formation, or that doesn't permit the stabilization of these grain boundaries, right? In simple terms, so the gamma is a grain boundary energy required to form grain boundaries. If sufficient time is given for single crystal growth, like you do in this case, right? the crystallization also happens in the regions where otherwise grain boundaries would have formed. Since you are not giving sufficient times for crystallization to happen in those regions, which otherwise would have been grain boundaries, right? So in the case of a polycrystalline system, you end up with grain boundaries. Okay. Now, that's it. So go back to that. Yeah. Now, you have, so my final aim is to make barium titanate, right? Barium titanate, yeah. So I start with constituent oxides of, so the most stable form of barium, I said, is barium carbonate and titanium dioxide. They're in the 1:1 ratio. And so you start the reaction by heating them up to certain high temperature, okay? And of course, this temperature depends on the melting point temperature of one of these compounds. So if the melting point of one of these constituents is 1000 degrees centigrade, the other one is say 950, you start at a lower temperature so that you don't melt either of those compounds, or the low melting compound is not really melted. It's not required. But here is a catch here. So what happens when you take barium titanate and titanium dioxide in this form, right? So formation of a compound called barium titanate is all about diffusion, is it not? So you need to have these ions from this side have to migrate to the other side or diffuse to the other side, and ions from that side have to diffuse to this side. Okay, so you need to have the titanium 4+ ions diffusing to the left side of the matrix, and similarly your barium 2+ diffusing to the right side of the matrix. Okay, now these two are bulk materials, and diffusion in bulk materials is extremely slow. We can actually calculate the time, because you see, this is a solid where my atoms are all fixed in their lattice positions. And of course, I'm providing thermal energy because there can be no diffusion at room temperature. Is it not? There cannot be any diffusion at room temperature. Computer is hanging, but it doesn't matter. Yeah.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
So how will we remove the carbon out of this barium carbonate?
Carbon goes out, that's a very simple thing. It just
okay, it evaporates maybe.
It just goes away. Yeah. Carbon goes out during the high temperature process. And since you're heating both the constituents in a normal air furnace, right?
It goes out in the form of CO2 maybe.
Yes. Oxygen automatically adjusts to, O3 to form the AbO3 lattice. All right.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
But the crux of the whole thing is about the diffusion here, right? So the whole process of diffusion is governed by well-known Fick's law. Okay. So where D is a diffusion coefficient. So every system has a diffusion coefficient. Dou phi by dou x, or d phi by dx is a flux gradient, and J is a diffusing flux. Well, It's this fixed law of diffusion. It basically governs the diffusion process in almost all systems. If I have see diffusion in a gaseous medium is very fast. So if someone comes into my room, opens a perfume or spray bottle and sprays at one corner of the room, I can smell it in the other corner within no time, right? This is diffusion through air. Second one is I take a beaker of water, put a drop of blue ink, and you see that the blue ink nicely spreading out. That's diffusion through a liquid, no? Which is a little slower than diffusion through air. But diffusion through solids is extremely, extremely slow. So even though I start with barium carbonate and titanium dioxide in their bulk form and subject them to, say, 900 degrees centigrade of heating, all right? And if you calculate the uh, diffusion coefficients in both the cases, especially in solids, these are even at 900 degrees centigrade, the diffusion lengths are in micrometers to nanometers. They range from nanometers to micrometers. At extremely very high temperatures, 1500 to 1800 and all that. So you can increase the diffusion lengths, right? That's the reason why in single crystal growth, you're actually taking the whole compound to its liquid state, molten state. So where the diffusion is also much faster. But in a polycrystalline system, you're not taking it to its melting point, right? So this way, if I just start with two solids, and I want to see the formation of the final product here. So if these are the actual sizes, and if this whole thing has to be converted into the new phase, because you see, crystal growth, thin film growth, polycrystalline material growth, it's all about nucleation, right? So that is where the nucleation happens, is it not? And because that's the only phase where the diffusion is happening now, because initially the diffusion, that's a boundary at which a diffusion happens, and you cannot imagine that these species can go to even to the middle or 1/3 of the portion of this side in sufficiently small times. This takes sometimes several months and years. If you just want to see the final product formation, if this block is, say, 1 inch and the other block is 1 inch with a cross-sectional area of, say, 1/2 inch. So how do you hasten up the diffusion process? So I hasten up the diffusion process by cutting down the size of these two entities. So what I do is, since it's a polycrystalline material, I powder it, I plunder it, attrition, mechanical attrition, right? I can just take a solid material and physical pounding reduces the size of these bulk materials into smaller entities. These are called particles, right? I can get down to smaller particles and yeah. And these particles, now, if you mix them up, physically mix them up, what happens? You'll start seeing yeah. So what I have done in this process by just a minute. Yeah. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to increase the process of diffusion by creating more number of nucleation sites. In this case, the nucleation site is only this interface. That's all. So what I've done here is I take this part, which is say barium carbonate, I plunder it. I apply this called the mechanical attrition. And mechanical attrition is of course a long process, and typically barium carbonate, titanium dioxide, and sulfides, nitrates. These are all ceramics. You can powder them down, and these powder particles with all kinds of shapes can be, with mechanical attrition, can come down to those sizes, 250 to 200 microns, which is fine, right? So now you can imagine if you start with this bulk material and this one on the other side, and if you start plundering them, pounding them, you get down to smaller particles of sizes anywhere from 25 to 250 microns. Anywhere from 25 to 50 microns is good. And then you mix that up, and then this mixture is again subjected to high temperature heating. But now the big difference is, compared to this one, in this case, I've created, you see, there's only one interface there, one nucleation site. But here, in this process where I have I have the particles of extremely small size compared to the reaction between two bulk counterparts. What I have done is I have increased the number of nucleation sites. You see, between the nucleation sites between the blue and red balls, a large number of them. So that means what? Instead of one nucleation site, I have now thousands and thousands of nucleation sites, because you can easily calculate from a say 1 centimeter cube how many 25 nanometer particles can be obtained. And now, if you have equal number of those many 25 micron size particles on both sides, and if they're mixed up well, so that, let's say, each particle A is in touch with particle B. So surrounding, you have alternating particles A and B. So you've created those many nucleation sites. This is fantastic, right? So, and then the phase formation will be much faster here in this case, right? Now imagine you take this particle size further down. Can you take this down to a few nanometers? Yes, can be. That's a process. There are processes, chemical processes, where you can take the material down to nanoscopic regime, but then this requires the ball milling process, the attrition, mechanical attrition has to continue for a few days, in some cases 4 or 5 days, because what you can do with the hand attrition cannot give you particle sizes below 25 microns. If you really want to go down to nanometric scale, because why nanometric scale? Because I then create much smaller particles, more nucleation sites. So the reaction will be much faster, because you have created so many nucleation sites. Okay. So that is the process of you continue the mechanical accretion process. There are special processes for that to achieve those nanoscale particles. Then the reaction is much faster because as the particle size goes down, always remember the surface energy increases. In fact, the energy required to for a reaction to happen between two particles, energy in the form of temperature, reduces as the particle size decreases because of the enormous increase in surface energy of smaller particles. You can make the same reaction to happen at a much lower temperature if the particle size is small. Now the question is, can I take the whole process by taking it down to atomic level? Can I atomize A and atomize B so that I have individual atoms of A, individual atoms of B, and when these A and B mix up in a proper stoichiometric ratio, I also have I provide oxygen, enough oxygen for the AbO3 to form. It is possible. That is the thin film growth process. See, there's a direct relation between, so the polycrystalline system that doesn't require you to take it to its melting point. You start with the bulk counterparts, but then reaction between bigger bulk counterparts is not useful. So you cut the size down to micron size, and then a mixture of these micron size particles leads to better formation. Better formation in the sense, look, if you start with, in this scenario of small particles, you have to subject the material to heating a couple of times, 900 degrees centigrade, 925 degrees centigrade, 2-3 times you have to heat the mixture. You heat it, then mix it again, so that any unreacted powder is, so that these multiple heatings are for increasing the homogeneity in the final composition. So the whole process of barium titanate from individual barium carbonate and titanium dioxide takes about a week or so. It's a long process because you take it down to this small particle size, put it in a furnace for anywhere from 12 to 18 to 24 hours, first heating, second heating, third heating, and finally the compound comes. But in a thin film growth process, of course, you start with this as what is called the target material or the source. And then you break up the source by some means, right? And you atomize it. And at the atomic level, you make the reaction to happen. And this process leads to the formation, crystallization in the fastest possible manner. So a barium titanate polycrystalline sample that takes, say, 1 week to prepare. Of course, single crystal of barium titanate takes much more longer time. But if a polycrystalline material is taken as a source in a thin film growth process, break it up again into its individual constituents through one of these growth process, PVD or CVD, say mostly PVD, physical vapor deposition, which say I use one of the PVD techniques and I break up this target into individual constituents. And these constituents recombine back into the lattice called AbO3 or BaTO3. So this process is much faster. So the bulk counterpart, barium titanate, polycrystalline barium titanate, that to prepare that, if it takes 5 to 6 days, I can transform that bulk polycrystalline material into a single crystalline thin film in time scales of few tens of minutes. Because in thin film form, the whole reaction process is almost at the gas in the gaseous state, atomic level mixing. See, atomic level mixing is always faster. So that's what you learn in this course. So I hope now you're clear about what is single crystal, what is the definition of a single crystal, what is meant by polycrystal. I've also now explained how to get to this polycrystalline form. Because of this cooling process, right? You end up with those grains and grain boundaries. So it depends on how finely you tune the the final temperature in order to minimize the grain boundary widths. Why minimize the grain boundary widths? Because we left the class with this question. Now I get silicon in its single crystalline form, the same silicon in polycrystalline form, the same silicon in amorphous form. Now you must be wondering, now what happens? Why we are not talking about the amorphous state? It's very simple. Amorphous state is a non-crystalline form. You take any material to its melting point, like what you're seeing here, right? Yeah. And I said a melt is required for a single crystal growth. Take a material to its melting point, slowly cool it, extreme slow cooling, you get a single crystal after a few days. Sometimes it takes several weeks. But from the melt, so what I said, this time that is given, you're giving sufficient time for atoms to find their lattice positions and a perfect crystallographic order sets in. But what happens if you rapidly cool this material like that to room temperature? So you have the melt, all of a sudden you quench the melt. This is called the process of quenching. You quench the melt to room temperature or say ice temperature. You know what? That means you're not given any time for the atoms to settle down to their lattice positions. And this leads to a chaotic atomic structure, which is the glassy behavior. So glass, the glass that we know, the transparent glass that is used in households, everywhere. So glass is made of silicon dioxide, right? Beach sand. You take it to its melting point, 1500 degrees centigrade and above, rapidly cool it, quench it rather, you get glass. So glass is amorphous. So the name glass is given to all amorphous non-crystalline solids. That's why you call it. So even in the case of barium titanate, the example I gave here, right? If barium titanate is subjected to same rapid quenching process, like what I have shown here, you get the glassy form of barium titanate, right? So you can get the crystalline form of barium titanate, you can get the polycrystalline form of barium titanate, you can also get the glassy form of barium titanate. So the term glass represents that there is no crystalline order in the material. Now, if you go there, the question is, if silicon is obtained in all these three different forms, so now you can make a single crystal of silicon, a polycrystalline form of silicon, and a amorphous silicon, non-crystalline form of silicon. So what happens to its physical property? So I said in yesterday's class that temperature variation of physical properties is very essential in order to distinguish between different properties of materials, is it not? Like what you're seeing here. You have superconductors, metals, that is conductors, semi-metals, semiconductors, insulators. And on the materials that exhibit magnetic properties, your diamagnetic materials, paramagnetic materials, ferro, ferri, antiferromagnets. So to distinguish all this on the left-hand side, you measure the parameter called resistivity. And this resistivity parameter has to be measured as a function of temperature. Without temperature measurement, you cannot talk about the conduction process. In a similar way, to ascertain the property of the magnetic behavior, you need to measure this parameter called susceptibility, magnetic susceptibility, chi, and this has to be measured as a function of temperature. And how do we do that? So we have we are lucky that we are able to liquefy nitrogen. When you liquefy nitrogen, its boiling point is 77 Kelvin. That means if I take liquid nitrogen and pour it on an object, you can cool it down to 77 Kelvin. But we know that absolute 0 K, right? Theoretically, it cannot be, experimentally, you cannot achieve absolute 0 Kelvin, right? But scientists are close to that value. We have already seen the achievement of 10 nanokelvin, right? So we are so close to absolute zero. That means minus 273.12 degrees centigrade is absolute zero. So you need to go below this temperature. So what we have is this wonderful liquid called liquid helium. When helium gas is compressed and liquefied, you get a temperature of 4.2 Kelvin. Then, of course, you have used helium isotopes. You do special pumping mechanism, dilution refrigeration. All that will take you down to further low temperatures, almost close to, as I told you, 10 nanokelvin is what has been achieved so far. So I can take all these systems. I can measure rho and chi as a function of temperature down to the lowest possible temperature. And I mentioned that, look, if I have copper at 20 degrees centigrade, this is a resistivity value of copper, 1.7 into 10 raised to minus 8 ohm meters. So the conductivity is inverse of that. So the order of conductivity is 10 raised to 8 Siemens per meter. And in the case of silver, the resistivity is a little lower. That means the conductivity of silver is a shade better than that of copper. So if you measure the rho versus T for these two systems, see, that's what I was talking about yesterday. The metallic behavior is same in both the cases, but you see the for in the case of copper, you see a little high value compared to that of silver, right? But the basic trend of resistivity versus temperature variation is same in both the cases because both are metals. This is an important point. In a similar way, you measure the resistivity versus temperature of a semiconductor. If you don't do this and get only the room temperature value, then you will not see this behavior. Same is the case here in the case of metals. These are the values given at 20 degrees centigrade. Now, if you don't measure resistivity in the entire low temperature region, you will not see this behavior, and then you cannot ascertain that it is indeed a pure copper metal with the alpha value d rho by dt, which is a metallicity, which should correspond to that of copper and silver. Same is here. Okay. Now, what happens when you see this? This is a very interesting chart. I'll come back to this later. Electrical resistivity is such a wonderful parameter. When you start measuring it as a function of temperature, this is probably the only measurement where it's very simple to do. You have a semiconductor or a superconductor or an insulator whose resistivity you want to measure. You just pass a current. You have a voltmeter, and for the current that is passed through, you measure the voltage drop. You get the R value. I know the cross section. I know the length of the conductor. I get resistivity. The inverse of that is conductivity, right? So I'll come back to that a little later because the conductivity, yeah, ohm centimeter inverse or ohm meter inverse, which is Siemens per meter, right? This should be ohm meter, ohm inverse, meter inverse, right? Like this, ohm meter inverse, this Siemens per meter. It varies over 27 orders of magnitude, all the way from metal semiconductors to insulators. This is a fantastic measurement that distinguishes between superconductors, metals, semiconductors, doped semiconductors, all the way down to insulators. Now, coming back to this question about what happens when you do this measurement, on silicon, which is in 3 different forms. Silicon, whether it is in crystalline form, polycrystalline form, or an amorphous form, the basic building block of silicon is silicon, the same, right? That you can confirm using crystallography. Okay. What differences you'll see in a crystallography X-ray diffraction measurement between single crystalline silicon, polycrystalline silicon, and amorphous silicon, we'll see later. So the basic building block cannot be different. Yeah. So then what happens to the conductivity when I measure conductivity of these 3 different forms as a function of temperature? The conductivity should also vary in this form, because it's a semiconductor still. It's the same semiconductor in 3 different physical forms. So what you would expect is something like that, right? Like what you see in the case of 2 different metals having slightly different conductivities. In a semiconductor also, I'm not comparing 2 different semiconductors here. It's the same semiconductor in 2 different forms. One is a crystalline form, the other one is polycrystalline form. So the beauty here is when a current is passing through this one and that one, yeah, the current passes through without any problem. But here, the current encounters those grain boundary regions. These are the high resistance regions. So you'll see an increased resistance to the flow of current in simple terms. So that's why, even though silicon in single crystalline form, of course, it's a semiconducting silicon in single crystalline form. In a polycrystalline form also, it is semiconducting. The semiconducting behaviors are same, but the increase in resistivity is clearly shown up, and that increase in resistivity is becoming because of the grain boundaries. Beautiful, right? Now, so this is why we need single crystals of materials is to eliminate these grain boundaries. You get a material in its perfect, pristine form, so that when you're measuring a physical property, you're measuring it without the problems, detrimental problems arising out of grain boundaries, like the current flow. And magnetic property could be also affected by grain boundaries and some other physical parameters, right? So if I'm measuring resistivity as a function of temperature for a single crystalline silicon, I have no issues of grain boundaries. Of course, that doesn't mean that amorphous silicon is not good at all. Amorphous silicon is easy to process, and people still use silicon for making solar cells. That's a different story. We'll see later. But basically, what you need to understand is, if you have a polycrystalline material, the same material in its single crystalline form, if you measure a property called conductivity, right? The basic conductivity, the nature of conductivity is same in both the forms, because both are semiconductors, but the physical nature, that is polycrystallinity here and single crystallinity there, has a bearing on the overall nature of the conductivity. So from these resistivity plots, with the increase in conductivity that we see in the case of the polycrystalline system, you'll even be able to talk about the conduction processes that are responsible for this increase in resistivity, right? That is a scattering process, additional scattering process coming from the grain boundaries. Grain boundary scattering leads to increase in resistivity. Okay, I think